Is the Ready a DAO or not a DAO? How would you tease that apart?
Based on listening to episodes of this podcast, I would say it probably is a DAO. And I'll give you an example of...
I was like, what?
Congratulations.
This is so exciting.
Officially a DAO. You get a stamp. You might even get an NFT.
Hey, everybody. Welcome to the show. This is Brave New Work, a podcast about reinventing our organizations and the search for a more adaptive and human way of working. I'm Aaron Dignan, and I'm joined by my co-host, Rodney Evans.
Hello, fellow humans.
We are also joined today by Chase Chapman, DAO contributor and host of the podcast On the Other Side, which is a fantastic podcast if you want to know more about what we're going to talk about today, looking at the intersection of crypto, culture, and society. Chase, welcome to the show.
Hello, hello. I'm excited to be here.
On today's episode, we're going to go down the rabbit hole, no pun intended, of Web3 decentralized autonomous organizations, or DAOs, and what all of that means for the future of work, which is what we care about here on this show. But before we unpack that, we got to check in.
We gotta. So we're gonna
do it.
So we'll start this episode like every episode. And someone popped a check-in round question here that I'm just going to ask because laziness. Okay, great. So our check-in question for today, brought to you by Aaron Dignan, is what makes a good morning? And I'm going to say, let's go Aaron
for the crowd.
Then Chase, then me.
For me, it starts with sleeping until I want to wake up. A good morning starts with just let's sleep in, because I'm a night owl, so that's important. And then I'm a big breakfast person. I love a big spread. I'm happiest when I'm like waking up late in a hotel and then going down to a large buffet. So that's my answer.
Nice.
I am the exact opposite. I am like a morning person fully. For me, what makes a good morning is getting up early. I agree though, sleeping in until my body's ready. I never set an alarm. And then starting working before the sun rises always makes me feel like I'm in this zone. I don't always get there. Recently, I've been traveling a lot, which has been harder, but that's what makes a perfect morning for me.
That is aspirational. We've started doing this thing. So our first dog, Banjo, was never allowed on a bed ever in his whole life. And our second dog, Rosie, we just are such softies now. And she sleeps in a crate at night because she's still very young. But we've started doing this thing where whoever gets up first lets her out. And then I pull all of the covers. It's usually Ed who gets up first. I pull all of the covers over my head. And then Rosie comes to find me. And it is... truly, she's like a little truffle pig. She like makes all these snorting sounds and then she like digs under the pillows. And then it's just like, she's so excited when she finally finds my face that she basically has like whole body convulsions. So any morning that is a good morning involves Rosie unearthing me from our bed.
That's perfect.
It's pretty great.
That's the best way to get up.
It's not bad. She's real cute. So today's topic is the future of web meets the future of work. And we are big fans of yours, and we are very excited to get into this. So let's just start with this. Chase, how did you get involved in the crypto space? What's your background, and how did it lead you down the rabbit hole?
I love this question. So I actually got into crypto because I was working in marketing, doing sort of like data analytics. We had this strange problem with data provenance and ownership and all of these things. And at the time, crypto and blockchain was like the perfect solution to the data ownership problem because people love being like, crypto will solve this. And, Of course, it's much more complicated than that. But that was the way it was being proposed at the time. And so I really started diving into the technology and got really obsessed with it because it felt like the new evolution of the web, and really started like exploring the space in general, and actually ended up co-founding a developer tooling company because I was very interested in making things easier for end users, but for developers, it was really hard. So, have been in the space for a while, was building that, and then actually came across DAOs not that long ago, had been in the space for a while, but DAOs were a little bit quieter then because there's a lot of history about DAOs that have gone through ups and downs. And so once I discovered DAOs, I got really, really obsessed with this idea of flexible work, actually owning what you're doing, sort of an interesting combination of socialism and capitalism and all of these different models. And so that's sort of how I fell down the DAO rabbit hole. And since then have been contributing to DAOs, experimenting and exploring in the space.
It is interesting. It feels like the reason the rabbit hole metaphor works, right, is it's this weaving, winding from this thing to this thing to this thing to this thing. And even for us, I remember even before the DAO happened and blew up, that we were looking at this. I wrote a few sentences about it in Brave New Work, and then it just kind of went away from consciousness for a while, and then came back with a vengeance during the pandemic. So yeah, I think your story resonates with anybody that has already started to dig. To back up for a second, though, for our listeners, which I think probably cover the gamut from pretty serious players in the space to people that have not even really heard the word DAO before, can we just answer some basic questions and set some definitions? So what is Web3 and why does it matter at a high level? How would you kind of share that with someone at a cocktail party?
I love that. Yeah, the way that I like to think about Web3 is, of course, the newest evolution of the web. So right now we're in Web 2, which to me is really about connecting people. I think there are more academic definitions of that. But you think about Facebook, you think about Instagram, a bunch of different sort of social networks. And I think what's most interesting to me when you compare Web 2 and Web 3 is this idea that we've built a digital landscape, a world that we live in, even more so because of COVID. But it's sort of in its feudalist stage where most of the software, most of the content, all of these things that exist in our digital worlds are controlled by companies. Mm-hmm. And so users don't really have ownership or a say in how their data, how their software, how all these different things are built and managed. And the way that I like to think about Web3 is the evolution towards a digital democracy where people own the platforms that they use, but they're also compensated for the value that they create. So something like Facebook pays you in the ability to use Facebook, but they also sell your data. And that's like, I think most people,
and your
if
democracy.
given that trade-off, and your democracy, yes. And I think that if you're given that trade-off, a lot of people would not be saying yes in the way that they are now, which is sort of consenting by using the platform. Mm-hmm. And so I think that Web3 is really a digital democracy in terms of an evolution of human society, especially because we're living more and more in the digital world. So that's sort of how I would describe Web3. I know that seems very fluffy, but once we get into the tactical stuff, I think it will make more sense.
No, totally. And I saw a good thread the other day that was really breaking it down. Like Web 1 was the company makes the content and owns everything. Web 2 is the people make the content and the company owns everything. And Web 3 is the people make the content and the people own everything. And that felt like reasonably good shorthand.
Oh my gosh, yes. And it's interesting too, because we've seen so many Web 2 companies make so much money off of what people are creating. And yes, giving them an audience, but they don't really own their audience. So it's been challenging. And I think that's what's exciting about Web3 for creators, but also, as we'll get into, for people who are creating value within companies, which we would traditionally think about as employees.
So one of the things that I've found interesting and also challenging in my own self-education is like trying to dive into DAOs, then being like, wait, I need to understand Web3. And then it's like, wait, I need to understand the blockchain. And it's like, wait, I need to understand smart contracts. And it's like, oh shit, I really need to understand like the financial crisis in 2008 in a different way. So like, it just feels like layers on layers on layers of things to know.
Oh yeah. Lots of acronyms.
So if you were going to define, Chase, some of the building blocks like blockchain, crypto, tokens, NFTs, DAOs, can you give us like the quick and dirty and hopefully how those things fit together for someone who does not have a mental model that sort of paints the portrait of Web3?
Yes. So blockchain is the technology that enables all of this. You can think about blockchain at the level that you think about internet, probably. Maybe like TCP/IP, which is the protocol that allows you to transmit information across the internet. The main point here is like, you don't really need to think that much about blockchain. The important part of it is that it's distributed. Instead of having like AWS run code, you have a bunch of different distributed people. That makes it really resilient because no one can shut it down. Mm-hmm. But it also creates this ability to have a shared database of everything that's going on. So you don't have to trust a single human. you can kind of think about it like in the financial revolution. And it used to be that like the kings in the church, wrote down who owed who and they were in control of it. But then they realized that everyone could just keep a ledger, and that would be kind of mind-blowing for people, because it was like, oh my God, we could just decide to transact together sitting on this podcast instead of having to go to the, church and say, hey, I wanted to loan Rodney this money. Yeah. So that's kind of like the blockchain. Smart contracts are essentially just programmable code that you can have do interesting things that can be run on the blockchain. So this is like, I want to loan Rodney money, and I want to do it if she provides this collateral or something. So it's just programmable actions that are then executed by this group of people. And then the third piece on top of that is Web3, which is sort of leveraging all of these pieces to build this like new digital, landscape. The thing that I would tell people that's most important is understand the basics, maybe take a day to do that. Do not worry beyond that. Like, don't really worry that much about proof of stake. Don't worry about proof of work. There are all these things that are going to come up because people love using jargon to sound smart. But the reality is that it's not really something that you need to worry about. And you will slowly come across it and realize it. But I think a lot of times it feels like you can't start to understand other things that are going on. I think the best way to learn is to explore things that you're actually interested in, and then sort of go down the little side rabbit holes, but learn when you have to get yourself out of those rabbit holes, because it can be really easy to dive way too deep into all of them. And so I would say, if you're thinking about how to get from 0 to 100, 0 to 50 is just like, what is a blockchain and smart contracts? I'll take a day. But 50 to 100 is like, what are DAOs? And going deep into that, because you'll realize that a lot of the models that exist are actually things that are like very much tangible in real world instead of this very abstract technology stuff. I guess the one other thing that would be worth pointing out is tokens. So there are tokens like Bitcoin, Ethereum, you'll hear like all of those things. Those are basically the currency of a blockchain. So you can think of those kind of like US dollars, which is the currency of, a nation. And then you have tokens that are the currency of companies and communities. And you can think about that more like stock in a company. We will get into probably what that means. But I think that's probably also worth sort of noting in your head, because that's a lot of the levers that you can pull within Web3 to do interesting things.
That's a great starting point. Also, I have like 50,000 directions I want to go from there, but I'm not gonna yet because we have time.
Yeah, we have time. We can take it at a pace. I mean, that's what Chase just said. Don't try to
Don't try to do it all at once. Okay. Reining myself in.
So let's zoom in to DAOs, because I think the DAO space is the most overlapping with what we're talking about and trying to do on this show. And it's certainly one of the fastest changing and most interesting right now. But to start, maybe definitionally, what are DAOs? Where did they come from, to the extent that you know that? What's kind of the DAOs for Dummies story?
Yes. So DAOs are decentralized autonomous organizations. So they're an acronym, DAO. We can sort of break down what that means, but the basic gist of it is that DAOs are very much along the lines of a lot of the different self-managing organizations that you talk about on Brave New Work. It's just a question of, and we were talking about this before we started recording, ownership actually being given to people. So when you think about DAOs in general, I think there are different mental models to use for them. And I'll sort of like share 3 different ones, which go from tactical to sort of theoretical to future of where they're going. And I think this sort of helps in like navigating it, because if you're trying to think about DAOs and you're thinking about them as a super abstract concept, it can be really challenging. And so when I first started diving into DAOs, I was like, okay, I need to come up with mental models for this, because this is way too confusing. So the first mental model is companies. And this is a useful model in terms of being just very tactical in how you think about DAOs, where people in crypto, and probably to your listeners, this is going to sound ridiculous, but a lot of times I think in crypto, for people who aren't super familiar with the way that, flat organizations have been run and things like that, it feels like DAOs are just this space where anyone can start taking on any work and there's no real organization to it. But really, they tend to be organized in teams. Sometimes we call them working groups or guilds, but they're just like departments of companies. It's like marketing, development, ops. You have these different teams that exist. So that's sort of like the base layer. They tend to make money, like most DAOs have revenue. So they're a lot like companies in that way. The second layer is co-ops. And the reason co-ops are an interesting model is that DAOs are typically owned by people who create value in them. And the way that you give that value to people is by giving them, traditionally, this doesn't always happen, but in most DAOs, a token that represents some type of ownership. And there's a lot of nuance to what that ownership actually is, but let's just say for the sake of this, ownership in the DAO. And so if you're providing value to the DAO, you essentially can earn ownership in it, a lot like a co-op where you have employees that own the organization and then they govern it and all these different things. The third layer that gets interesting is that DAOs sort of take this idea of giving ownership to people who create value to the next level, in that instead of just giving it to employees like a co-op typically would, they also give it to partners. They give ownership to investors, really anyone who's creating value in a bunch of different ways. And sometimes you'll even have mission-aligned organizations within your network that you give ownership to. And that's where DAOs actually are a lot like networks. So David Ehrlichman wrote a book about impact networks that I think is really great. Book. And I've been pushing that to everyone who's interested in DAOs because I actually think DAOs look a lot more like networks where you have this sort of decentralized as a broad ecosystem way of working, but you do have these like teams within it that sort of collaborate with each other. Everyone has some sort of shared context. And so that's sort of like the ultimate vision, I think, for DAOs. And so in that sense, DAOs are decentralized in that they're not owned by a single entity. Anyone can start contributing if they want to. They're autonomous in the sense that I think employees or people creating value have the autonomy to contribute. That's not traditionally what autonomous means in DAOs, but I think that's much closer to what they actually are. And then, of course, they are organizations of people. Now, of course, how granular you get changes what the organization is, but that is sort of broadly what DAOs look like. So an example really tactically is that I'm a contributor to multiple different DAOs, and I, in some of them, help with diversity efforts, and in some of them help make videos. And that's a completely different range, and I get paid differently for those things, but I get paid in ownership in the network via tokens instead of, traditional money, though comp structures can also be different. But that is sort of like the gist of what's going on with DAOs.
That was such a good explanation. That was the best explanation that I have heard anywhere.
Yay, I appreciate that. I'm
well
glad.
done, you.
There's a lot of stuff.
It's a lot of stuff.
There's a lot of rabbit holes we could go down in everything that was said, but that's the gist of it.
Awesome. Okay, so 2 follow-ups on that. Where are DAOs? Where do they exist? And what do they do? Or what can they do?
Ooh, so it depends on both of those things on the DAO, but DAOs traditionally are digitally native organizations. So a lot of them don't have a headquarters or any physical thing that ties them anywhere. That's not always true. There's a DAO called Cabin DAO that essentially owns cabins, and you can rent them out, and it's amazing, or City DAO. So that's not always true, but they tend to be digitally native. Even something like Cabin DAO started online. Discord is a very popular tool for that, which is probably going to change because it's really hard to use. And then in terms of what they do, this is where I think this company co-op network analogy can come into play. A DAO can do most things that a company can do. So a lot of DAOs want to generate revenue. In order to be sustainable, but also to be successful. So they can do things like build software. They could do things like buy cabins and rent them out. They could be nonprofits. You could really do a bunch of different things. But you can also create larger DAOs made up of mini DAOs that have bigger visions. So you can think of the United Nations even kind of like a DAO. Like it's made up of many different entities. They engage with a lot of different entities. They engage with the IMF and lots of different countries. And so a DAO can be a bunch of different things. But I think at the sort of core unit, a business is probably a good place to start.
Nice.
I've really been excited by the just sheer creativity of what kinds of projects or initiatives can happen in the DAO space. Because certainly there are, let's build a software product or let's, build cabins or whatever. But also something like Krause House, like let's crowdfund and buy an NBA basketball team, or Constitution DAO. Let's take public ownership of a private asset and return it to the public, even though it didn't work. That kind of stuff is super different than what you would typically see like an LLC set out to do.
Oh, yeah. I mean, this is where things get interesting too, is I think one of the core primitives that DAOs enable is actually collective ownership. And collective ownership can mean a lot of different things. In one instance, it means buy things together and basically do cool things with whatever you buy. Which is an example of Krause House, which is trying to buy an NBA team, or Constitution DAO, which tried to bid on a copy of the Constitution, for anyone who hasn't heard of those. And then I think where things get interesting is taking it to the next level of, because you're able to do things like collectively own the Constitution or collectively own an NBA team, you unlock a lot of design space for what can be done with the thing that you own. Because traditionally, you would have an organization that does this, and there's not a lot of collective creation in that, because you still generally have these, business objectives or hierarchical like structures that tend to have some idea of what you want to do with it. But I actually think that when you enable collective ownership, you enable this next level of collective co-creation that actually might end up changing some of the things that we do with ownership. And what I think is most exciting is that it gives an opportunity for those things to become social movements. So there's an amazing person who is sort of in the crypto space named Sursu, and he led this like movement to buy Black CryptoPunks. So CryptoPunks are these like NFTs that are very popular and they're really expensive. And Black CryptoPunks were really like low in terms of price compared to every other CryptoPunk. And so Sursu sort of spearheaded this thing called Crypto Cookout, where people collectively pooled money to buy really low priced Black CryptoPunks so that the price of them was higher as sort of this like social movement. And so I think when you think about all of the things that can be done with collective ownership and this social, it's really ultimately a social primitive for doing really interesting things, I think that it unlocks a lot of potential for collective organizing and a lot of different things that just haven't been traditionally available to people in sort of the first place, which I think gets really interesting.
I think technically we now need to go back and define NFTs.
Oh, yes. So NFTs are basically unique digital things. And you can think about them kind of like the Mona Lisa is unique. There's only one of them. NFTs are a similar concept where you have something online that is unique in its own existence. You could have a house that is an NFT in sort of the real world. Right now, they're really popular as collectibles. So you can think about, baseball, trading cards, that type of model is how NFTs are used, where you have, let's say, the special trading card that only exists. There's only a certain serial number on it, so that you own that specific NFT. And they're used for a bunch of different things. That's not really a great breakdown of what NFTs actually are, because there's so much space that people have now explored with them. But people love buying artwork, and there's also this movement of buying these like avatar style artwork pieces, which is what CryptoPunks is. And NFTs have notoriously over the past few months been going for so much money. It's ridiculous.
So much.
And that's been getting them a lot of PR. So
And that CryptoPunk project, there are a dozen more like it where they have created, 10,000 or 5,000 copies, each one unique, of a particular piece of art. In this case, like very pixelated human-looking person, humanoid. And then they're sold, they're minted and sold, and then they're resold. And obviously the resale value of some of these things is getting up into the hundreds of thousands or even the millions because, I don't know, the art world and the collectible world is mental. But the point is, they noticed an inequity in the way they were being priced in your story there. And then people took collective action to basically recalibrate the pricing for those.
Also, everyone should listen to that episode of your podcast, Chase, with
Yes.
Sursu, because it was I learned a lot.
I appreciate that. Sursu is so amazing in terms of the way he thinks about culture. And it's people like that who are able to spark these movements towards people collectively owning something that a lot of times would just never have been possible in the first place when you think about, access to resources to be able to buy several $100,000 piece of art, regardless of, if it's an NFT or in the real world. Ownership has sort of been gate-kept to people who had the resources, whether it be social capital or financial capital, to access it. And I think DAOs broadly change that, which is part of why I'm really excited about them.
Yeah. I also just learned a very important thing, or had an insight. I don't know. But here's what I just learned from listening to you talk about this. In all traditional business, from startups to end-ups where we live and play, the point of creating it is to produce something that fits into a market or creates a new market. And so like the inception and the outcome and the journey in between is just about production. In a different space where the inception and the outcome is just about ownership, like that inspires a lot in terms of what the journey is in between, which I think is super, super cool. And I think one of the things that has been confusing to me as someone who is very new to this space is like, what is the point of DAOs? But in this conversation, what is emerging to me is like, the point of DAOs is ownership, and we don't totally know what that means yet in terms of what the limitless possibilities are of various types of radical ownership.
Oh my gosh, yes. And it's interesting because there's a really great piece from Darkstar, which is sort of this media DAO from Jared Dicker and a few other people who works for the Churning Group, which is like this big VC firm. And one of the things that they talk about that's really interesting is in American life in particular, we've seen sort of like the death of local communities where it used to be, in the early 1900s and even mid 1900s that your community was your church or all of these different really local establishments. But as we've moved digitally, we've sort of gotten away from that where you don't really have those localized groups anymore. I mean, you have Facebook groups, but I would argue that most people don't feel the sense of belonging and community ownership that you do in a Facebook group as you would in a church group. And I actually think part of what DAOs enable, and when I'm thinking about this, I'm thinking about what are past versions of collective ownership, even if it wasn't technically ownership, but it felt like it, that have been really powerful. I think the DAOs bring back some of that. And that's exactly what this piece sort of starts to argue, which is that when you own something, you start to feel like it's your home and you want to take care of it. But you also feel this belonging and sense of common ground with the people who you co-own it with. And I think that looking at the past of local institutions has shown us the power of that in terms of supporting each other, in terms of building really powerful and valuable aspects of our lives. And I think DAOs enable us to find that digitally without needing to be geographically close to each other. And I think that's where things get interesting. But I totally agree. I think it's an open space that we don't quite know what's going to happen, but we can look at little hints from probably the past to see what might happen.
Anything that can. On your show, you often ask guests about what is a DAO and what isn't a DAO. And the answers are pretty wide-ranging. And so we thought it might be fun on this show to talk about the Ready, our organization, and then to talk about why it's not a DAO.
So I like that.
Yeah. So the Ready is a public benefit corporation that was founded 6 years ago. It has, dozens and dozens and dozens of members. Anyone who's here for more than a year is granted ownership in the firm, kind of proportionate to time and contribution. And so it's co-owned by lots of people. It's completely self-managing. So there's no kind of traditional formal authority in terms of positional power. All the roles we have are created through governance and consent. All the circles or pods that operate are kind of free to do so within the scope of the domain they're given by the decision that created them. So it has a lot of traits. It's also quite international. It doesn't have an office. It doesn't have a headquarters. It's, members in dozens of different places. Is the Ready a DAO or not a DAO? How would you tease that apart?
Based on listening to episodes of this podcast, I would say it probably is a DAO. And I'll give you an example of...
I was like, what?
Congratulations.
This is so exciting.
Officially a DAO. You get a stamp. You might even get an NFT.
A pin?
The Ready is officially a DAO.
Nice.
So
Where's my board ape?
I think that if you take the approach... Well, I guess I'll take a step back first. The reason that I ask a lot of people what is and isn't a DAO is that I think my mind wants to categorize things. And I have a feeling that a lot of other people feel this way.
Of course.
And I feel like the reason that I always get different answers is that the reality is that the world doesn't fit into perfect categories.
Right.
Which fully makes sense.
Yeah.
that is a way that the world works. And so what I think is interesting is when we think about a lot of different organizations that look like DAOs and call them DAOs, I think there's value in that, in being able to say, this is a label that I know means something to me. And I'm looking for organizations that have certain qualities that matter that I can look to for inspiration. Because a lot of crypto, and I say crypto, I mean Web3, I sort of use those terms interchangeably, but
Sure.
A lot of this space is really, I say composable, but it's basically copying what other people are doing, because a lot of these organizations are super open. So you can
Right.
see what's working and what isn't working in different orgs really, really easily. And so I think the value of saying what is and isn't a DAO and sort of exploring what types of organizations might model DAOs helps us understand what we can pull from. And I know, everyone does this, but it feels particularly common in Web3 because everything is so open and transparent. And so an example of something that I would also call DAO is Wikipedia. I mean, a lot of people say that Wikipedia was the first sort of media creation DAO. And so I think the Ready is just as much a DAO as Wikipedia is a DAO, even if that was not necessarily the thought at inception or for the many years, that it's existed. And so I think from that perspective, it's very much a DAO. The couple of things that I always use as foundations that should at least be covered if something is going to be a DAO is true ownership, not ownership that's sort of really, really concentrated in the hands of certain people. And then self-management, which you guys, of course, talk a lot on this show about, because you want to make sure that there are these emergent properties. Mm-hmm. And those are sort of the ways that I categorize a DAO. There are a bunch of other things. Governance comes out of ownership and self-management, of course, but those are my foundations. So I would say that the Ready is certainly a DAO.
I mean, I think the only aspect of the DAO space that I find really intriguing on top of what we're already doing that has really drawn my curiosity is that because it's on, and Rodney, you were saying this before we started recording, because it's on actual pipes, actual technology that underlies it and supports it, it's a little bit more protected from bad actors, from things going wrong. If someone's hit by a bus, it can still operate. Like the autonomousness and the decentralization of it is more structured and more supported, I think, if it's actually on chain versus something that is, if you went through like court and probate and heirs and stuff, maybe you could fix an LLC if a bunch of key contributors died, but it wouldn't be easy or obvious how to do it. And so I do think it's a question of degree, essentially, like how far can we go with these ideas? And I do think that's really compelling.
Yeah, and I think it matters too. I guess the one factor that I would say is really controversial right now in the DAO space is how much do you gatekeep who can be a contributor? So my opinion of what decentralization actually means is that when you look at decentralized networks like TCP/IP, or I guess that's a protocol, but when you look at decentralized protocols like TCP/IP, but also the Ethereum blockchain, one of the reasons that they're so decentralized is that the amount of things that someone needs to do to run like a node on Ethereum, for example, which is just one of the computers that runs the code, it's really decentralized because they've tried to keep the requirements from a technical perspective pretty low. So you don't need a supercomputer to run this thing. And so that means that a lot of different people can do it. And so I actually think that a lot of decentralization is about the freedom to participate and choose how you want to participate in a network. And I think when you think about something like the Ready being a DAO, of course you hire people. And so DAOs do hire people. But one of the arguments or questions that's happening right now in the DAO ecosystem is how much do you choose among contributors who can contribute versus allow anyone the freedom to decide how they want to contribute and if they want to contribute. And I think that that's much more interesting and important in the decentralized ecosystem. There still needs to be friction so that you have, potentially mission-aligned people who are actually qualified to do the jobs that they're doing.
Sure.
But I think that that's an interesting aspect that probably makes the Ready a little bit different from some DAOs, but that's also a big question in this ecosystem in general that's sort of unsolved or unanswered currently.
Such a profoundly important question, actually.
It is, and it's something we talk about in self-management all the time because it's like what you're getting at, I think, Chase, is you have these spaces that are effectively emergent properties from collaboration of a lot of effort and humans and nodes. And that's rad, and it's also chaotic. And so in chaos, what we start to do is constrain and see what emerges from those constraints. And, I always think it's wiser to start unconstrained and add later. But like, you can't, chaos just begets chaos. So it can't just be kindergarten soccer forever.
Well, and emergence by definition is structure coming into reality through the properties of the complex system itself. So the idea that there's anything like a really large, really healthy, resilient system in the universe that has no structure and no constraints is just bonkers.
Yeah.
And instead it's like, no, what kind of coherence do we covet as a DAO? Not will we have any, but what will it be about? Will it be about mission, values, vision, identity, whatever, skills,
priorities,
trade-offs?
I think this is a really interesting point. I was listening to you guys talk about, I don't remember what episode it was on, but you were talking about how decentralized organizations actually tend to need more structure than organizations with a lot of hierarchy. And I thought that was so interesting because that's just not something that seems to come up a lot in DAOs, at all. But it completely makes sense. And I think part of that question is also how much do we automate those structures versus have them as very people-centric structures? I think the answer is probably a combination, like everything else. But it's interesting because I think when you think about where the term DAO came from, the initial intent of the term autonomous was really to think about DAOs as these organizations that run on their own, I think in a way that is automated much more than it is humans having autonomy. And I think that's evolved because we've realized that people actually do this. But it's interesting because I think we still tend to like to make these things like technically automated, when it's probably actually a combination of structure coming from the human side, but also from computers. And that's like an interesting balance that I think we probably don't explicitly talk enough about in the DAO ecosystem.
That totally makes sense. And there's so much in the structure and conversation that we run into with people who have mental models from traditional organizations and traditional startups, just like the kinds of companies that have existed for hundreds of years, where people go to codifying power dynamics. And that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about structure necessarily. We're talking about what is the structure of decision-making authority, or what is the structure of clarifying contribution, or what is the structure of incentive alignment. Not it's not a fucking org chart, but it's just, I think it's just a very interesting space to contemplate. So this is a real softball for you. If someone wants the experience of joining a DAO, how would they do that? I've joined a couple. It's really easy. And then it's also very overwhelming immediately after how easy it is. So for our listeners who are like, this sounds rad, let me in. Where should they go?
I love this because the way that you framed it, Rodney, is very much what I always like to tell people, which is that starting to contribute to a DAO is going to be uncomfortable. I'm just going to say that in the beginning, because you can easily start understanding what's going on, but actually figuring out where you fit in is a little bit harder, and you can do it. It's just going to be uncomfortable. So the basic steps are this. Find DAOs that you think are interesting. You can do this in Deep DAO, Snapshot. There are a bunch of different places that aggregate what DAOs exist. Click on them and figure out what you think is interesting. Join the Discord, which is where most of these DAOs tend to exist. Sometimes they're on Telegram, but you're going to have to spend a little bit of time learning about Discord, and I can send you guys a really good guide that you can link also so that people can check that out just
Awesome.
on how to use Discord because it's new and confusing. And then once you sort of lurk and see which DAOs you like really see what the conversation is, see what the vibes are, maybe hop on a couple calls. Most of them have open calls, so listen in. Start going to more calls, a few more on the DAOs that you think are interesting. Introduce yourself, all of that kind of stuff. And then look for opportunities to step up and take ownership over a few small things. So on these types of calls, especially if you go to calls for specific sort of working groups, which are sort of departments and companies, you'll start to see, let's say you're interested in marketing, so you decide to go to the marketing working group, you'll start to see opportunities to step up and get involved. Maybe it's managing the social media account for a week. Maybe it's creating a graphic. You'll find small ways to start contributing. There are also lots of other ways to do it. There are lots of different skills that people use. And basically volunteer yourself to do that task. And choose something small in the beginning because otherwise it's going to be confusing. But start doing it, and it's that process of stepping up and being like, hey, I want to do this, that can be really uncomfortable because no one's going to tell you what to do. You basically need to find ways to create value. And after you start doing that, you'll very quickly, at least in my experience, snowball into doing more because people will start to know, Rodney's the one who creates graphics. Mm-hmm. Oh, ping Rodney and see if she can make this specific graphic. So you'll start to see that. But it's that moment of going from, okay, I see what's going on, I'm trying to make sense of everything, to actually getting on a call and stepping up that can be uncomfortable. And the way that you can do that is there are usually different roles that you choose within a Discord. So there'll be a marketing and design role, and you can choose those to find where you want to go. I think probably what you're getting at, Rodney, is the information overload is a really big problem.
Oh my God. Yeah.
Which I know you guys also have thoughts on from a transparency perspective, which I think is really interesting. DAOs have very much not figured this out yet. So it can definitely be uncomfortable, but it's really about going through that process and starting to try things out. And once people see that you're trying, if you have challenges, they will reach out. But definitely don't reach out and ask people what you should do. Just start exploring. And if you're not exploring in the right category, people will sort of say, hey, maybe you should work on this instead. And so I think from that perspective, it's really just about trying.
That's really cool. It funnily sounds very, very similar to onboarding
Very
with a
familiar.
self-managed system. And actually, as just a reference / plug, which I don't think I've ever done before, to our own fucking podcast, the episode with Alistair about onboarding yourself into self-management is almost verbatim what you just described, Chase, which is hang out, figure out what's going on, get oriented, look for ways in which you can contribute that aren't irritating to other people or don't require effort of them. And definitely be cognizant of the fact that if you're just wandering around, waving your hands and being I want to help, that is not helpful to anyone.
Yeah.
Yes. 100%. People make this mistake a lot in DAOs, by the way. I'll constantly hear people say, I reached out to this community manager to see what I can do. And it's I understand why you have that mindset.
Sure.
But let's back up a little bit and let's change it so that you can be helpful. Because otherwise people adopt the same mindsets where you're told what to work on, and that's just a good way to stall and never actually do anything in a DAO.
It's like walking up to a big friends group in a bar that you don't know and being like, hey, how can I be helpful to you guys? How can I be friends with you guys? It's that's not the entry point.
Oh, yeah.
So what I'd like to jump into now, just based on the mirror image of the two worlds that were just described, is when you look at DAOs and where they are in this moment, what are they getting right about new ways of working and governance and how they operate as a system? And maybe where are they falling short or even snapping back to old models or doing things that feel that's not what we set out to do?
I think there are a few things. I think onboarding is definitely something that we need to work through. Part of it is just teaching people how to think differently. I feel like we kind of just throw people into the ring and see what happens, and we probably need to work on that, which is not so effective. There are a lot of different things that come to mind. Some of them I've heard you both talk about on this podcast, one of the ones that I've been thinking a lot about that's most interesting that I heard you, I think, I can't remember their last name, but Ted, who came on, which I thought was really interesting. Yes. So something that I thought was interesting about that was this idea of diversity being something that's a big challenge, where a lot of times what happens is people say, hey, anyone can start contributing. You know, it doesn't matter who you are, what your background is, what your identity is. Anyone can come up and start contributing. And the challenge with that is twofold. The first is that that's not how it works. Yes, anyone could, but there are a lot of like systemic barriers that make that completely untrue. And so you have this weird gaslighting challenge where it's like, well, technically anyone can contribute. It reminds me a lot of when people are like, you know, we have a Black president, so racism is dead. It's like, that's obviously not true. There's so many systemic barriers to getting to that point. And so I think that's sort of the first challenge. The second challenge is that particularly when you think about diversity in these contexts, what you'll end up have happening is because the back end, as we've talked about it or sort of framed it, of DAOs is ownership, not just flat organizations that don't really give people ownership. What will end up happening when you have organizations like DAOs that are not diverse, and also because people who are involved get ownership, you end up still concentrating ownership in the same types of people's hands, basically. And so you have all of this, all of the very stereotypical tech bros owning most of these networks. And so that's a really big challenge that I think needs a lot of work. And I'm not entirely sure how we get there. This is something that I've been doing a lot with Index Co-op, which is a DAO that I contribute to. And we've made a lot of progress in getting more female and non-binary contributors in particular. But it's been a lot of sort of trying different things and seeing what works. So that's one. And then I'll say the final one is this question of how you govern and who governs, I think is and that's something that you guys talk about a lot. But we're sort of today conflating ownership and governance power. And I'm not entirely certain that that's the best way to do it, particularly because governance requires context. But we have this weird problem where we're trying to conflate them, partially because of legal reasons, but also because that's sort of how things have been done so far. And it's becoming very clear that that's not quite the right model. So those are some of the challenges. There's a lot more, but those are to me, some of the key ones.
The latter one is the one that I'm most soapboxing about at the wall when no one's listening to me. I'm just these two things are not the same. They don't have to be the same. They shouldn't be the same. The people that own, a majority stake in this token should not be trying to run it based on that cap table all the time for every fucking decision.
Well, and this is something that we're struggling with in DAOs, I think, because part of the sexy thing about DAOs is that you're an owner, so you get to make decisions. And the way that you become an owner is very meritocratic because you do things that provide value. That's sort of the ideal. Obviously, when you actually apply that in real life, that doesn't work. But when you think about it that way, it's holy shit, that's so freeing. And I think actually that meme sort of has pushed this narrative very far. And we haven't really thought about the ways that we actually go about this. So there are tools like Orca Protocol that are sort of helping try to divide up voting power among people who actually have context about it so that everyone doesn't have to vote on random things. But it's definitely something that I think from an organizational perspective, we have to figure out. And when I have you guys on my podcast, I think that would be incredibly interesting to talk about.
We're very excited about that. And given that you listened to Ted's episode, I did want to ask you, in my reading about DAOs and governance and decision-making, what I see is a lot of reference to consensus and a lot of reference to voting. But I don't see reference, and Aaron also just taught me today that there is also auto voting that's happening. I didn't know about that. But what I haven't seen yet, and I'm curious if your take on this, Chase, is any reference to consent rather than, yes, I am in support of this. Are there ways that are that you're seeing right now where people can be this is safe to try, or I am neutral on this. I neither object nor am I part of the consensus that is supportive, because I think in large complex systems, consent-based decision-making is a really simple and very powerful tool.
When I think I was first exposed to consent-based decision-making in David Ehrlichman's book, because I believe he talks about it in that. And I thought it was really interesting because we currently don't talk a lot about that. But I think part of the reason is twofold. The first is our tools for governance are not quite there yet, and not necessarily from a technical perspective, but from just like a human framing perspective. And I think the tools that we're using have a really big impact on how we think about a lot of these things. I think the second piece is that we currently don't have models for what different engagement in voting looks like that are widely adopted. So it's sort of either
interesting.
you're a DAO token holder who cares and follows every single thing in the governance forum.
Yeah.
Or nothing.
Yeah.
We don't really do a good job saying, hey, choose what you care about. Maybe look at some of these, and if you're okay with it, cool. But you can be neutral, and that's still being a productive part of the system.
Yeah. And that like, if you want to be a more passive voter or consenter, doing a quick review with the lens of like, will this do harm versus diving into every new proposal. Like, I see things at the ready proposed routinely that feel like they're very much on the fringe to me and very much like things that don't have any potential to do harm. And I'm like, I don't even need to read this. I'm like, this is for sure safe for someone to try. So yeah, I think that's interesting. It's that polarity between like reading every single footnote and social loafing. And like there has to be a third way between those.
What's interesting about the model that you're talking about that I think is absolutely not explicit in DAOs, but perhaps needs to be, is the default answer is yes if you're asking yourself, does this do harm? Because it's like, if it doesn't, then it's probably worth exploring. Like, what's the cost of it, basically? I don't think that that's something that we explicitly say in DAOs. I actually think we almost veer towards the other side, which is default to no. And if enough people support it, then yes, which is a different model in my head. I don't know if you agree with that, but it feels like a different model.
Yeah, it feels like the opposite. For sure. I mean, it feels like that's predicated on optimization, and default to yes is predicated on progress.
Yeah, which is an important distinction. I mean, I guess the question also is, if there is a proposal that costs a certain amount of money, do these proposals cost money? How does that work?
Sometimes. Often.
Sometimes they cost a lot of money.
Yeah.
Do you need more convincing based on how much they cost?
I would say it depends. To me, and Erin might have a different answer, I would say it depends on the domain. So if it is, for example, if someone wants to spend a lot of money on hiring, they're like, I'm going to launch a thing and I feel very high conviction about this, et cetera, et cetera. I don't need a ton of convincing because the Ready is a services business that runs on human beings and having like the most qualified people who are difficult to find. Whereas if someone is like, I want to spend a lot of money on a branding campaign, I might be like, I'm going to like really read the fine print here because I'm not so convinced that that's something that we need. I'm not so convinced that that's something that's valuable. So for me, it's a little bit domain specific. Certainly the dollar amount comes into play because $10,000 versus $500,000. I'm looking closely at the $500,000 proposal, but it's also a little bit like domain based for me.
The thing that I would add
so it's
to
almost
that,
based on needs for you.
Yes. And priorities of the organization. So I'm like, if our priority is around growth is based on capable humans, spending money for capable humans just like is intuitively correct to me.
Yeah, it's about priorities. It's about like the logical stack that you were just describing. And it's also for me about, is this principle divergent or is it just like a degree of cost?
Yes.
So if someone proposes something where they're like, I'm proposing something that is not aligned with our current principles as an organization, that I'm like, I need to zoom in on that a lot. But if somebody proposes something that's just more expensive in alignment with existing principles and patterns, it's like, oh, well, that's actually not that hard to wrap my head around. And so actually I can kind of play that game. I feel like there's a difference in our systems between distributed authority and decentralized authority that has not been clarified in the DAO space. And in a decentralized authority, you're basically just saying there's a lot of authority everywhere, but in order to make a decision on something, in theory, all of that authority can weigh in. And distributed authority is the idea of we've taken authority and we've moved it around so that I don't necessarily need to give a shit about the sticker campaign in the marketing organization.
Yeah.
Right. Like I've given my vote away. I can always take it back through high level governance, but I've given it away temporarily through the act of distributing that authority with consent to be like, you know what? You guys run your play and like, we'll see how it goes. And I don't need to weigh in, which is a very different and very freeing idea.
Feels like we need more of the latter in particular in DAOs.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think there's ways to do both, but I think we have to build the lattice work and the superstructure that allows both to happen in the right balance and to modulate each other over time. Like a good governance system should be able to play with that balance between what is distributed and what isn't, and how we make different kinds of decisions, based on the results that are happening rather than just based on some, line of code or what have you.
And just hearkening back to the conversation we were having before about decentralization requiring more structure, like to me, this is the flip, right? Which is spending the time to create, as Aaron called it, the lattice work, or like, so I'll use our own system because I know it. Roles have spending authority that is agreed to. We spend time agreeing to that authority so that we don't have to spend time on what that on when that authority exercises itself.
Right.
And if you don't do the former, then you have to do the latter.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really interesting. We're definitely dealing with a lot of this from a delegation perspective in DAOs. Mm-hmm. They're definitely, I speak from a perspective of contributing to certain DAOs and sort of watching the space. I'm sure that there are some DAOs that are doing this well, but what I've seen is we're okay at delegating authority on decision-making broadly. Mm-hmm. We are less good at delegating authority on decision-making categorically. And I think that definitely matters with what Aaron's talking about with distributed authority. Totally. And that is definitely a challenge.
The last thing that I would just touch on briefly is from my very brief exposure to DAOs and DAO proposals is that we haven't spent a lot of time learning how to write good human proposals.
Yes.
So, part of the time cost and the context challenge and the ability to make these decisions effectively is how well we author the proposals themselves and how parsable they are and how readable and understandable they are at a glance. And I have definitely gotten into a few where I'm like, I basically have a PhD in this stuff, and I'm reading a governance proposal where I'm like, I need a glass of wine.
I think this is a really interesting challenge that feels like we could solve it in a way that's not very hard, not very high friction, in the sense that we look at what people like you have already been thinking about. The other thing on this note that I thought was really interesting was the episode on retreats where you ended up talking a little bit about stewards of proposals versus proposals themselves.
Yeah.
And I think right now we also conflate those things where if you trust someone in the community and they have a proposal that they're putting forward, there's sort of two interesting dynamics. One of them is you want to trust them because they're part of the community, but also there's a weird interpersonal dynamic where it's like, I like this person. I don't want to vote no to their proposal because I feel like an asshole. So I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to say yes, even though I don't really think this is the smartest thing. Yeah. And so I loved the idea of separating those things with the acknowledgement in the back of my head that one of the challenges is that DAOs are super fluid work. So you need people to commit to things in order for them to happen. And so I think that there's probably interesting models to explore there as well, with proposals existing in a much better way than they do today, but also finding a better way to figure out who, after a proposal has passed, is going to steward it. And then maybe this is a topic that we get into at another point in time, but deciding if there isn't someone to steward it that seems like a good fit, do you sort of just not do it? There are interesting questions there, I think.
Yeah. Yeah. We would love to do that because, as you've heard, we're wrestling with the same things. If there's not someone who is a safe pair of hands who also has the time and energy, what should we do with that?
Well, and I like the idea of getting more modular, imagine how interesting it would be, Rodney, to govern a proposal anonymously, who it was from, not who's participating, and then govern a second proposal, which is who's going to actually do this work.
Yeah. I think it's really wise.
Yeah, tease those things apart. I think that could be very interesting. And hopefully, I mean, that's a lot of what we're trying to do with tooling, both in the DAO space and even with Murmur, like getting tooling to a place where we can actually pull that off, I think would be pretty cool.
I think that's really smart. And it's like, that gives it like makes my stomach hurt. Cause on the one side, I'm like, but like, I know that as a power holder, I get shit passed. But then it also scratches the itch in my brain of, is this a quality proposal that I created, or do people want me to be happy?
Right.
And I do have that. I do hold that paranoia when I like hit submit on a new proposal, and anonymity would very much clarify the merit of my ideas.
Totally.
I love that. Let's do it. Let's try it. Let's do an experiment.
So to wrap up, I kind of want to dial into one of the stated aims of your show, which is how crypto might shape society and change how real humans live their actual real lives. And so when you peer into the crystal ball and think about the real life implications and changes coming down the pike, what are you hoping / expecting to see in 2, 5, 10 years, or really whatever time frame you're comfortable speculating about? What are you hoping for? What are you imagining? What are you expecting?
This is a really interesting question. I think I'm going to have a very boring answer, which I actually think that I've been thinking a lot about this. Ideally, what we build is actually quite boring in 10 years, where people are like, yeah, of course that system works. I'm not worrying about that. And I think that that's not a sexy thing to work towards. And it's easy to say an ownership economy where everyone owns part of the value that they create. And I think that that's very much true. But I think what's interesting is that success to me actually looks like that being something that people take for granted because it's so deeply entrenched in our digital landscape in general. And so I actually think that that's what I'm working toward when I think about this stuff, because it's one of those things that often isn't the sexiest thing, but is actually like truly where I hope we go.
To be so successful that your work becomes invisible is a pretty good goal. And
yes, that's a beautiful way to put it.
A pretty good place to draw things to a close. So, Chase, where can our lovely listeners find out more about you and your work?
Yes, so I'm most active on Twitter. You can find me at Chase Chapman, but there's an R in between, so it's Chaser Chapman. I also have a podcast called On the Other Side that you two will be on soon, which I think will be really fun. And then I also am contributing to a few different DAOs, which are in my Twitter bio. And I think a lot of the DAOs that I contribute to are quite friendly to people who want to dive in. So if you do want to dive into DAOs, I would highly recommend checking those out.
Amazing. Chase, this was so fun for us. Thank you so much for coming today.
Oh my gosh, it was so fun for me too. I'm so glad we got to chat. Thanks for having me.
If you all like what you're hearing out there, a review would mean so much to us, or forward our show to somebody who needs to hear more.
And as always, a quick tip of the hat to Taylor Marvin for making the three of us sound good today. Brave New Work is produced by The Ready, where we help organizations around the world change the way they work, maybe as a DAO, maybe not. Get in touch with us by emailing podcast@theready.com. And as for you, thanks for listening. Now go change something.